In the middle of the 1970s, the American dream felt like it was running on fumes, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the suburbs of Los Angeles. The seismic cultural shifts of the 1960s, the summer of love, the protests, the promise of a new age of consciousness, had soured. The hippie movement had withered into self-indulgent folk rock, and the revolutionary spirit had been replaced by a deep-seated cynicism, amplified by the paranoia left behind by the Manson family murders, a homegrown horror that proved paradise had a dark, violent basement. For the children of this era, especially those rattling around the vast, featureless landscape of the San Fernando Valley, life was a strange paradox. It was a world of material comfort and spiritual poverty, a world of sun-drenched swimming pools and a profound internal emptiness. It was a cultural vacuum where the dominant sounds were the slick, hedonistic rhythms of disco and the mellow, introspective chords of corporate rock. For a certain kind of teenager, the restless, the brilliant, the angry, the ones who felt like aliens in their own homes, this placid suburban surface was not a comfort, but a prison. It was a void, and a void, by its nature, demands to be filled. Out of this stifling ennui, a new sound began to crawl from the cracks. It was a raw, primal scream against comfort and apathy. This was the birth of Los Angeles punk rock. It was a different beast from its cousins in London and New York. It wasn't fueled by political rage against the class system or by artistic ambition in a bohemian scene. LA punk was a howl of suburban nihilism, a violent reaction to having nothing to react against. It was a scene born in the shadows, in forgotten, dilapidated clubs, and its ground zero was a filthy, windowless, unventilated basement on Hollywood Boulevard called The Mask. It was here, in this literal underground, that the scattered tribes of suburban runaways and misfits found a home. And it was here that a strange, fiercely intelligent boy named Paul Beam would find a stage and begin the process of transforming himself into a prophet for this new angry generation. The future Darby Crash was born Paul Beam on September the 26th, 1958. His early life was a blueprint for the instability and alienation that would define his art. His biological father was largely out of the picture, and he was raised by his mother, a woman who struggled with her own set of challenges in a home that was often chaotic. A defining and traumatic event of his youth was the death of his older half-brother from a heroin overdose. This early intimate encounter with the finality of drugs and death left an indelible scar on Paul's psyche, planting a morbid seed that would grow alongside him, ultimately dictating the terms of his own final chapter. Even as a child, Paul was an outsider. He was socially awkward, preferring the company of books to the company of his peers. But what set him apart most was a sharp, intimidating, and deeply unconventional intelligence. This intelligence was so singular that it earned him a spot in a radical and highly controversial experimental education program at his public high school. This program, known as the Innovative Systems Program, or ISP, is one of an essential little-known keys to understanding the man he would become. To understand Darby Crash, the ideologue, the manipulator, the cult leader, you must first understand the ISP. The ISP was a utopian educational experiment, a product of the anti-authoritarian ideals of the late 1960s. It dispensed with the entire structure of traditional schooling. There were no formal classrooms, no letter grades, no required curriculum. Instead, students were encouraged to form their own corporations and pursue independent study on any topic that fascinated them. The core philosophy was to foster creativity and critical thinking by encouraging students to challenge authority and develop their own unique charismatic methods of communication. For a mind like Paul's, already predisposed to grand theories and intellectual rebellion, this environment was not just liberating, it was empowering. It essentially provided him with a 4-year state-funded masterclass in how to become a charismatic leader. He and a small circle of other gifted outsiders, including a quiet, lanky classmate named Georg Ruthenberg, formed a corporation to study what they cryptically termed thought-provoking subjects. In reality, this was a deep dive into the mechanics of power, persuasion, and social control. Paul devoured the works of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, internalizing the concepts of the Übermensch, or Superman, who creates his own morality beyond the confines of good and evil. He was captivated by the cyclical, pessimistic historical theories of Oswald Spengler's magnum opus, The Decline of the West, which argued that cultures, like organisms, have a lifespan and are destined to decay. He studied the methodologies of cults like Scientology, not as a potential convert, but as a strategist, learning the tools of psychological manipulation. The ISP gave him the language and the framework to organize his own feelings of alienation into a coherent, if disturbing, worldview. It taught him how to build a mystique, how to command attention, and how to weave esoteric knowledge into a compelling personal narrative. It was also here that he solidified his friendship with Georg Ruthenberg. They were a study in contrast. Paul was the intense, verbal, and often abrasive leader, while Georg was the quiet, watchful, and loyal follower. They were bonded by their shared status as outsiders and by a mutual love for the androgynous, performative rock of David Bowie and the raw, self-destructive energy of Iggy Pop and the Stooges. In 1976, after seeing a picture of the Ramones, they were struck by inspiration. They would form a band. It was a decision made with absolute certainty, a conceptual work of art that preceded any practical considerations, like the fact that neither of them knew how to play a musical instrument. For Paul, the concept was always paramount. The band would be his ultimate tool for social and cultural infection. He began the process of transformation. He shed the name Paul Beam and became Darby Crash, a name that fused a boy-next-door innocence with an image of violent final impact. Georg Ruthenberg was reborn as Pat Smear, a moniker that was simultaneously a punk declaration and a nod to his burgeoning interest in gynecology. They knew they needed a bassist and a drummer to complete the picture. They approached a striking but painfully shy fellow student named Teresa Ryan. Though she had never held a bass guitar in her life, she had the right look. Darby, with his flair for the dramatic, christened her Lorna Doom, a name that sounded like it was pulled from a gothic romance novel. After cycling through a few temporary drummers, they settled on another inexperienced but enthusiastic local, Don Bolus. The lineup was now complete. Darby called his creation the Germs. The name was a mission statement. It was provocative, ugly, and unforgettable. The germs were to be a contagion, a sickness designed to invade the bloated, complacent body of mainstream culture and rot it from the inside out. Their first forays into live performance were less like concerts and more like acts of Dadaist theater or public meltdowns. At their early gigs at the Mask, they were legendary for their sheer, unadulterated chaos. Darby would prowl the stage, screaming his dense, semi-intelligible lyrics over the thunderous, arrhythmic noise his bandmates were producing. He was a dervish of self-abasement, a punk rock shaman channeling the frustrations of his audience. He would smear his body with peanut butter, pour lukewarm beer over his own head, roll in shards of broken glass, and hurl himself into the small crowds, blurring the line between performer and audience, pleasure and pain. The band, meanwhile, thrashed away with a kind of heroic incompetence. They were loud, they were sloppy, and they were utterly compelling. This initial period was not about musical proficiency. It was about the raw, unfiltered expression of an idea. It was about rejecting convention so completely that they had to invent their own language. And at the center of it all was Darby, not just a singer but a director, an ideologue, meticulously crafting the band's image and mythology, even as they could barely play a single chord in unison. It was during this formative, chaotic period that Darby began to articulate his grand design, the central pillar of his personal mythology, the 5-year plan. He spoke of it constantly, first to the band and then to their rapidly growing circle of followers. It was a chillingly lucid and disturbingly prophetic outline of his life's work. He explained that he would devote 5 years to making the Germs an infamous, legendary force. He would use the band as his pulpit, disseminating his ideas and building a loyal tribe around himself. He would push the limits of performance and public outrage. And then, at the very peak of this notoriety, before time could render him irrelevant or age could soften his rage, he would purposefully and publicly commit suicide. To most, it sounded like the morbid, theatrical boasting of a troubled teenager high on his own budding notoriety. But to those closest to him, it was clear he was absolutely, deadly serious. He did not see suicide as an act of weakness or despair. He saw it as the ultimate act of will, the final perfect aesthetic choice in a life conceived as a work of performance art. He was already writing the last scene before the play had even truly begun. As the band's strange charisma began to attract a following, Darby's control over his small tribe intensified. He designed a simple, stark logo for the band, a single blue circle, a symbol that was deliberately neutral and open to interpretation. He then encouraged his most ardent followers to brand this symbol onto their skin as a Germs burn, a circular scar left by a lit cigarette. This ritual was a painful, visceral act of initiation. It was a physical manifestation of their devotion, a permanent mark that separated the true believers from the mere fans. Darby wasn't just the leader of a band. He was the head of a burgeoning suburban cult. While his punk contemporaries in London and New York were using anarchy as a slogan, Darby Crash was putting his theories of manipulation and mind control into practice on the streets of Hollywood. By 1979, the band's musical ability had, against all odds, begun to catch up with the power of their concept. The raw noise had coalesced into a sound that was tight, ferocious, and brutally efficient. Darby's apocalyptic poetry now had a disciplined, powerful sonic assault to back it up. Their growing power on stage caught the ear of an unlikely champion, rock and roll icon Joan Jett. She saw through the chaos to the raw genius underneath and offered to produce their debut album. The resulting record, GI, short for Germs Incognito, is a landmark of American music. It is a 30-minute, 15-track manifesto of pure punk rock fury. The album captures the band at its peak, a perfectly balanced storm of chaos and control. And at its center is Darby, no longer just screaming, but articulating his nihilistic worldview with a terrifying clarity. On the album's best-known track, Lexicon Devil, he lays out his mission statement for all to hear. "I'm a lexicon devil with a battered brain," he snarls, "and I'm heading for an abstract plane." It was a direct announcement of his 5-year plan to shed his physical body and become a pure idea, a myth. The release of GI brought the Germs a new level of notoriety, but it was a notoriety steeped in infamy, not commercial success. Their live shows had become legendary for their violence. The intense devotion of their fans often spilled over into bloody brawls with rival punk factions or the police. Soon the inevitable happened. Club owners, tired of the riots and the property damage, began to refuse to book them. The Germs were systematically blacklisted from nearly every venue in Los Angeles and the surrounding counties. This prohibition only served to amplify their mythic status. They were now true outlaws, a band so dangerous they weren't allowed to exist in public. It was at this precise moment of peak infamy and forced inactivity that they were immortalized by filmmaker Penelope Spheris in her now legendary documentary on the LA punk scene, The Decline of Western Civilization. The footage of the Germs in the film is one of the most essential and haunting documents of the era. The live performance captures the band in all its terrifying glory. Darby is a man possessed, a magnetic, frightening presence, his eyes rolling back into his head as he unleashes his fury upon the microphone and the audience. But it is the interview segment that offers the most revealing and tragic glimpse into his psyche. He sits on a sofa in a cramped, messy room, flanked by two young, adoring female followers. He is profoundly intoxicated, his speech slurred, his eyes struggling to focus. He attempts to articulate his complex theories on social control, his ambition to rewrite the dictionary, his belief that he can manipulate people's minds. He comes across as both a charismatic genius and a deeply pathetic, lost child. He is a boy playing with philosophical dynamite, a young man who has constructed an elaborate intellectual fortress around himself, now trapped within its walls, drowning in the persona he so meticulously created. The Darby Crash persona was a mask, an armor built to protect the fragile, insecure young man underneath. Behind the nihilistic pronouncements and the intellectual bravado was still Paul Beam, a person driven by a profound and often contradictory need for human connection. The Germs were not just his pawns. They were his deeply dysfunctional family, and he was their abusive but magnetic father figure. He ruled them through a combination of intellectual intimidation and emotional manipulation. He would lash out with verbal cruelty, often targeting Pat Smear to assert his dominance and test their loyalty. He demanded absolute fealty, and his moods could turn on a dime. Yet, there was an undeniable bond that held them together, a shared understanding that they were all outsiders participating in something unique and important. Pat Smear would later describe Darby as a true genius, a one-of-a-kind mind, while also readily admitting he was an asshole who made their lives incredibly difficult. The emotional core of this strange family was Darby's relationship with Lorna Doom. Quiet, stoic, and almost ethereal in her presence, Lorna was the band's silent anchor. She seemed to possess a deep, intuitive understanding of Darby's turmoil, and she absorbed his rants and his chaos with a serene, sisterly patience. She rarely spoke, but her steady presence seemed to ground him, to connect him to a world beyond his own spiraling thoughts. A significant and often unspoken source of Darby's inner torment was his struggle with his own sexuality. In the aggressive, hyper-masculine, and often virulently homophobic world of early American punk, Darby was a closeted gay man. This created a deep chasm of shame and self-loathing within him, a conflict he could never resolve. His public persona, with its intellectual aggression and its flirtations with macho fascistic imagery, can be seen as a desperate overcompensation, an attempt to build an armor of toughness around his vulnerability. He preached a philosophy of absolute self-control, yet he was a slave to his own repressed desires and the ever-increasing amounts of drugs and alcohol he used to numb the pain. This internal war is key to understanding his tragedy. He was a young man who craved love and acceptance, but had built a persona that made it impossible for him to either give or receive it honestly. As the Germs' notoriety grew, so did the controversy surrounding Darby's ideology. The most difficult and enduring stain on his legacy is his deliberate and sustained use of fascist aesthetics. He would often perform wearing a swastika-like armband, and he spoke admiringly not of Nazi politics, but of Adolf Hitler's masterful ability to manipulate a populace through symbolism and mass psychology. It is crucial to understand that Darby was not a political white supremacist. He was a provocateur and an intellectual nihilist. For him, fascism represented the ultimate rebellion against the peace and love generation. It was the ultimate aesthetic of power, order, and control. In his deeply perverse intellectual framework, embracing the imagery of history's greatest evil was the most punk rock act imaginable, an act designed to shock, offend, and force his audience to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. It was an appallingly juvenile and dangerous intellectual game, born of the arrogant belief that he could control the meaning of symbols without ever being consumed by their inherent evil. This leads to the central unresolvable debate at the heart of the Darby Crash story. Was he a genuine, if deeply misguided, punk rock philosopher who used transgression as a tool to expose the vacuity of modern life? Or was he simply a brilliant but profoundly disturbed young man, a narcissist whose delusions of grandeur were tragically enabled by a subculture that was starving for a charismatic leader? The truth is, he was both. He was a visionary who correctly identified a spiritual emptiness in the world around him. But the cure he prescribed, a cocktail of nihilism, control, and self-destruction, was infinitely more poisonous than the disease. The myth of Darby Crash, his most ambitious creation, had become a terminal illness. By the beginning of 1980, the 5-year plan was nearing its end, and the band that was its vehicle had sputtered to a halt. Blacklisted from every club in their hometown, the Germs unofficially broke up. Darby, disgusted with a scene he felt he had already conquered, impulsively fled to London, the city he saw as the Mecca of punk. He was searching for the next wave, a new movement to co-opt and lead, but he arrived too late. The London of 1980 had moved on. The raw anger of 1977 had been replaced by the moody artistic stylings of post-punk and the flamboyant, fashion-conscious new romantic scene. In this new world, Darby Crash, the prophet of LA punk, was a nobody. The experience was a profound humiliation. It shattered his ego. He cut off his iconic untamed hair into a severe glam-inspired style and adopted a faint British accent. He became obsessed with the pop star Adam Ant, following him around the city like a common fan. The cult leader had been reduced to a follower. Broken and completely disillusioned, he returned to Los Angeles later that year. His trip abroad had taught him a harsh lesson. The only part of his grand narrative he could still control was its ending. He was now resolved to see the 5-year plan through to its bitter, logical conclusion. He contacted Pat Smear and proposed one final definitive reunion show for the Germs. Pat, perhaps sensing the finality in his old friend's voice, agreed. The show, held at the Starwood Club on December 3, 1980, was a massive, sold-out event. It was a chaotic, triumphant celebration of the band's legacy. By all accounts, Darby was on his best behavior. He was lucid, powerful, and professional on stage, delivering a performance that reminded everyone of the ferocious talent he possessed. For the thousands of ecstatic fans packed into the club, it felt like the beginning of a glorious comeback. For Darby, it was his last will and testament. He had gathered his flock one last time to say goodbye. He took the few $100s the band earned from the performance, went to his drug connection, and bought a supply of high-grade heroin, enough to ensure his plan would not fail. 4 nights later, on December 7th, he was ready. In that quiet back house, he orchestrated his final performance. He administered the fatal dose to himself, lay down beside his friend Casey, and let go. In his mind, it must have been the perfect exit, the ultimate aesthetic choice. He had lived by his own twisted code, and now he would die by it. It was the final desperate act of a man who believed above all else in the power of his own will to shape reality. But reality, in the end, is not so easily controlled. The news of John Lennon's murder on December 8th was a tidal wave of global grief that washed away everything else in its path. It was a story of hope destroyed by senselessness, a public tragedy that united the world in mourning. The meticulously planned, philosophically driven suicide of an obscure punk rock singer in Los Angeles simply could not compete. Darby Crash, who had dedicated his life to becoming a legend, died in near total obscurity. The immediate aftermath was one of shock and quiet grief for the small circle who knew and loved him. The Germs, of course, were over for good, but their story and Darby's ghost would continue to haunt the landscape of American music. The GI album, a commercial failure in its time, became a foundational text for the next wave of punk. Its speed, power, and intelligence provided the blueprint for the genre that would become known as hardcore. Bands from coast to coast, from Black Flag to the Meat Puppets, owed a significant debt to the Germs sound, and the members of his band, the quiet disciples who had stood in his shadow, survived. Most remarkably, Pat Smear's journey became a powerful and poignant epilogue to the story. More than a decade after Darby's death, he would be recruited to join Nirvana, at that time the biggest and most important band in the world, playing alongside another brilliant but doomed frontman in Kurt Cobain. After Cobain's own tragic suicide, Pat would become a core member of the globe-trotting, stadium-filling Foo Fighters. Pat's long and successful career stands as a testament to the talent that Darby had both nurtured and nearly destroyed. It is the story of a survivor, a quiet witness who carried the memory of his chaotic, brilliant, and impossible first band with him out of the darkness and into the light. Ultimately, the story of Darby Crash is a profound and deeply American tragedy. It is the story of a young man of singular intelligence and vision who, in a desperate attempt to escape the void of his own life, constructed a persona so demanding that it consumed him whole. He wanted to be remembered as a myth, a concept, a lexicon devil who operated beyond the bounds of human frailty. But his true, enduring legacy lies not in the myth, but in the flawed, brilliant, and tormented humanity he tried so hard to conceal. He failed to become the global headline he had planned. But in that failure, he left behind something far more potent and authentic, a single perfect album of teenage rage and philosophical despair, and a haunting cautionary tale about the deadly allure of an idea. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up, let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.